Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst this week's news items we have things that will make you shake your head in horror, or at least horror at the failure of the American education system, the effects of COVID on your brain years after infection, regrowing retinal cells using nanotechnology, development of treatments and notably theoretical vaccines against things like malaria, the evidence that cats really are assholes and in this case carry unknown diseases. Exposure to certain scents when you're sleeping could alter your brain function and at least theoretically improve it. Cats are being given COVID medication for, well, COVID. The French researcher Didier Raoult is found to have even more issues with the ethics that they've used for their research into hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. The Fred Hutchinson's outreach office in Spokane has a interesting contest running where you need to name a colon. The defense of GMO products and what it takes to win the lottery, at least in theory. Let's start with something that's in some respects horrifying. A post to what can presumably be Facebook, found on Twitter. Or is it X now? The post itself asks whether or not taking Botox is okay in a anti-vaxxer group. Somehow, they're concerned about injecting something that is quite literally called botulinum toxin and is one of the most deadly things in the world, and they're more concerned about vaccines, one of the safest medications in the world. As is demonstrated by the responses to this, anti-vaxxers have no understanding of anything, let alone what they're actually having an issue with, or in this case, happily embracing. The vaccines are safe, Botox, arguably, definitely not safe. Next we have news for those of you who let's say, entertain yourselves, and that the toys involved with that could be shedding hormones that disrupt part of your body. Although this is a somewhat controversial topic, and we have to dance around YouTube's, let's say, rules regarding what is and isn't allowed on the platform. The evidence is mounting that due to the lack of regulation and lack of assessment for risks, these toys could be leaching out chemicals and that these then disrupt hormone balance within your body. This is the same argument around the use of PBS and similar plastics in drink bottles. In this case, it's the combination of plastic, silicone, rubber, and latex that, well, given that they're interacting with very personal membranes, and particularly mucous membranes that will, to a degree, absorb these chemicals, you can imagine why there's concern. The specific compound in question are phthalates, and these are known to have issues to do with human health, particularly around the liver, kidneys, lungs, and, well, importantly for where these are being used, the reproductive system. As a result, there are, let's say, concerns being raised about their presence, how much leaches out, and whether or not the toys in question should be regulated. The research raises concerns not just for the individuals involved, but for our channel's monetization. Of these, the individuals we have a lot more concerns about immediately. Notably, the research tries to correspond what is effectively a mechanical or analog of a real-world usage and apply the results of that to, well, real-world usage, which may or may not be an accurate comparison. Slightly more realistic is the, real-world data about long COVID and the effect it has on the brain. This research comes from King's College in London and Imperial College in London. They were trying to understand the cognitive performance of about 3,500 people infected by COVID-19. The idea is to figure out whether or not the infection with COVID-19 does really have a significant effect. And what they've found is that it's about a 10-year increase in age, or at least on average it is. This is, however, based on only 2 time points. Each test involved was conducted about 9 months apart, so we need to be a little more cautious with this, as amongst other issues, a lot of things can happen in 9 months. We don't know exactly how well each individual was before, if there are other complicating factors, and more that could be a serious issue. There are also more questions raised by the fact that at least a subset of this group did have a complete recovery to comparable standards to those who have never been infected with COVID-19. This raises some questions, let's say, about the cohort involved and how well controlled it is. In other somewhat neurological news, we have the fact that females are more likely to develop migraines than males, and just why this is. Migraines are a real pain in the head. But more than that, they are also associated with nausea, vomiting, and sensitivity to light or sound. The experience, let's call it, can go for hours if not days, and this is a big issue for those who experience it. At least as far as females are concerned, it may also be a gift that adolescence also gives you, other than anxiety and bodily changes. The evidence isn't perfect, but it's fairly substantial, and it indicates that estrogen and progesterone could have a big role in causing migraines for women or females. The fluctuation in particularly estrogen, although progesterone does have a role to play too, can kickstart the migraine, and particularly those who have migraines with odours, a particular kind of or subset of migraines. This is also why you can kickstart the migraines for these individuals by giving them estrogen-containing contraceptives. It is also a major reason why individuals who do have these kinds of migraines are told not to use them and instead opt for other contraceptive methods. There's also medications, particularly triptans, that are used to treat migraines for these individuals as they work around the issues involved with the hormones involved. This is not to say that men as well don't have the issue, just that it's significantly more common in females. For men, it generally occurs before 20 and after 50, and this again relates to the fluctuation in hormones within the body. Shifting to research that's slightly more useful right away, we have the growth of retinal cells using what is described as nanotechnology. Retinal cells are what allow you to be able to see, or at least see in the center of your vision. Getting macular degeneration is what's going to affect these, and it essentially gives you a massive blind spot, quite literally. The research is building on, prior research, which was able to develop the necessary cells on a 2-dimensional plane, that is, creating them on a left and right axes and spreading them across. The human eye is, not that. It's curved to start with, but more importantly, it is 3-dimensional. And as a result, that research didn't really translate very well. The new technology does somewhat mitigate this by using a scaffold. The Nottingham Trent University biomedical scientist Viola Bergon was able to create the 3D scaffolds with polymers. These were then coated with a steroid which prevented inflammation, and then using a process that created just nanometer-wide fibers, they were able to get the cells to start growing on these. They've effectively turned a 2-dimensional surface into a 3-dimensional surface. However, the research does have one big drawback at this stage that's going to prevent it from becoming a real-world treatment, so to say. That is, the cells could only be kept viable for 150 days. Given most people live for far more than 150 days, that's not good enough. It's not even good enough to try and replace red blood cells which survive for 180 days. And we've already been able to grow those to some extent artificially. The next test is rather obviously going to be trying to transplant these cells into someone or something that is, blind. And that will be an interesting blinded trial, ideally double-blinded. We now have research that's more significant based on recent years, and that is developing vaccines against the next and newest pandemic, even if we don't know what it is. The research is based in the UK and is, being conducted in Porton Down, Porton Down is a, let's say, ubiquitous name given what's being done there. It is a high-security laboratory in the UK which is effectively specialised in, well, amongst other things, bioweapons until relatively recently, although arguably that's still the case. What's also useful with this facility is that, well, since they have all these particularly nasty pathogens, they can look at what they do, how they do it, and theoretically start making vaccines. This is not just a scattershot approach where they're just randomly choosing diseases out of a hat. Rather, there is a list of animal viruses that they consider capable, if not likely, to infect humans in the future. And obviously, their other concern is the ability to spread. Based on this, they've created a hit list. The list they've made is intended to be worked through sequentially, with the most concerning run downwards, or by the availability of developmental technologies around it. In a move possibly inspired by Twitter, and now X, the disease has been called Disease X. The work is in some ways very similar to what was done with COVID-19, particularly around the mRNA side of things. The mRNA vaccines were already pretty well developed in other work areas, particularly thinking of things like HIV, but there was also existing research from SARS, and when you combine these two, you could streamline the necessary development of a vaccine, taking what should have been 10 years or more of development, testing, and clinical trials into about 1. With this work, you have the same basic premise. By having all of the foundational work and as much knowledge built up about a disease before it becomes a disease and a problem, you're able to very quickly develop and deploy vaccines or other treatments to it. One example of a disease that they're already well on the way to developing a vaccine for is Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever. This is a tick-borne disease that kills about 30% of those infected, and they're about to start a test of this with 24 volunteers, so that clinical trial will be interesting. There's also no real cure to other diseases at the moment, like stupidity. Well, there's one cure, but it's rather permanent. Another disease this week that has useful developments around it is malaria, and that a chance discovery may help us dealing with it. Malaria is a parasite born by mosquitoes and spread between humans. The parasites infect red blood cells and hide from the immune system for a time, multiply, break free of their host cell, and infect new red blood cells, eventually destroying the body's ability to, well, supply oxygen, nutrition, and more. It's why it kills more than 600,000 people a year, debilitating many hundreds of thousands more, and is one of the more nasty diseases out there. This is where research by GlaxoSmithKline has at least theoretically made a step towards dealing with it. One of the difficulties with malaria is that most of the target sites within it are either common to humans, so any attempt to attack malaria will also attack the host, or they're so esoteric that we're having trouble developing technology to deal with it. It's why particular protein portals within the malaria parasite are what are being looked at the moment. This approach is completely different. The chance discovery was all related to the fact that they were trying to figure out why the mosquitoes that they were using for drug development just weren't getting infected with malaria, or at least had stopped carrying it. It turns out that they had a bacterium within their GI tract that stopped the malaria parasite from being able to infect those mosquitoes. The team put the study on hold in 2014 and then came back to it in 2016. What they found was that the specific strain of bacteria, TC1, which is a naturally occurring bacterium, did not allow the malaria parasite in the digestive tract of the mosquitoes to procreate and colonize. What is arguably even better again is that, well, for the mosquitoes, it provided a lifetime protection, which means for the little bloodsuckers, they could keep on sucking blood with no real risk of getting any negative effects from carrying malaria. By itself, it's not a great deal of use to humans, largely because infecting everyone with a bacterium that's, at this stage, very early on in its clinical significance is highly questionable. The other option is to look at what the bacteria was making that would help to protect the mosquito, and it's a molecule known as harmine. This is what GlaxoSmithKline is looking to use as either an oral treatment or, if need be, something like an injectable vaccine or treatment. In news that's similarly related to diseases, but a proof that cats really are arseholes, a man bitten by a stray cat has developed an unknown infection. This clinical case study from the UK is further proof that this is why you don't try and pet the random floof in the form of a cat. Dogs are fine, cats are not. The 48-year-old, who ended up becoming hospitalized because of this, had to, undergo quite an ordeal. It's largely because the scientists who were trying to figure out what the hell was under their microscope just couldn't identify it. They'd not seen it before. If you've ever had a cat scratch, you know that the area around the scratch generally gets swollen, and this is an inflammatory response to the cat's claws and the damage it does, along with the germs within it and similar. That's unpleasant, but in this case it was so much worse. Within 8 hours of being bitten, the man took himself to hospital. That's how much his hand had swollen. The treatment given at the time, which was a tetanus shot plus some antibiotics, just wasn't enough, and the guy went back the next day, and this time the doctors had to surgically remove the tissue around where he had been bitten. They also gave him a cocktail of antibiotics, and even more antibiotics to take orally. Then he went home again. This is where the things get kind of weird. They were able to remove the tissue, and obviously they could get cultures from this, but all they could really tell from analysing it under a microscope is that it kind of looked like a streptococcus. The streptococcus is a particularly nasty kind of bacterium. One variant you might be more familiar with is strep throat, or the kissing tonsils disease. Unfortunately, it's a somewhat large genus, and as a result, it can cause all kinds of issues, and we obviously don't know what they all are. That's why, despite looking like streptococcus, it wasn't. It turns out it was another group of similarly looking bacteria called Globocatella. Globocatella is similar to strep in all its appearances and behaviour, but it's also distinct. This particular new species of it was also different by about 20% at a genetic level. And not only did it have unique features, some of these unique features make it antibiotic resistant, and that's a big problem. It is still vulnerable to certain antibiotics, so that's not a massive issue, but nonetheless, it is a indication of problems that are emerging. In news related to that, or more accurately related to felines, at least in Cyprus, cats had been given anti-COVID pills because they had been infected by COVID-19, which is a slight concern. The fact is, COVID is growing and it's still prevalent, despite how little coverage gets in the news. In terms of Cyprus, however, they had to start giving them COVID medication because cats in Cyprus were dying by their thousands. Good news to this is that the particular strain of coronavirus they're infected with is not transmittable to humans. However, between cats, yes. The exact number of cats that have died has been argued between animal rights groups and veterinary associations, with animal activists have made claims of up to 300,000 cats, while veterinarians are claiming under 10,000. In other animal-related news, although this time clinically relevant to humans, we have the research in Switzerland by ETH Zurich using an electronic device to stimulate the production of insulin in rodents. The idea here is that you can quite literally stimulate the rodent pancreas to release insulin, which would then help with health and well-being. There is a strong case to be made that this could help with genetic-related issues, for example diabetes. If you were to initially stimulate the production of insulin for those who have diabetes, particularly type 1, you could theoretically help to get the ball rolling and create a cascade where theoretically the body would keep producing insulin and would stop the body from attacking the necessary cells to produce it. This is done by creating reactive oxygen species through that electric stimulation. The electric stimulation produces reactive oxygen species, Reactive oxygen species triggers cells to respond to it, and that response generally involves altering the epigenetics of the cell in question. This is basically an on-off switch that's used to either tell a cell to express a gene or to stop expressing a gene. The good news to the technology as it's being developed now is, first of all, they've at least been able to demonstrate it does what we've described in a rodent model, but also it doesn't require any fancy power supply. It's quite literally 3 AA batteries, and that'll keep it going for up to 5 years according to the researchers. But that is also contingent on only using the system once a day and it working exactly the same on human scale as it does with a rodent scale, which is unlikely to be the case. Further news that's going to help at least improve your health is that certain smells when you're sleeping may improve your cognitive function, although this again is very preliminary and kinda questionable. UC Irvine found that if you were to take the group of individuals involved, 43 men between 1685, so we already have issues here, and you put different odours into the bedroom each night, you tend to see a slightly improved cognitive function. Although there are some concerns about how exactly they measured that as well. The first concern we have with this is that it specifically focused on elderly individuals, which is already a group more prone to cognitive decline than otherwise. The next is that, although yes, they did have a control in the form of a barely odorized version of what they were handling, there was nonetheless a, let's say, odor there, so there may be trace benefits regardless, but it's certainly far better than giving them water and telling them it's perfume. The next is that the process ran over 6 months, which is a very long time frame. The next is that the group that did actually have the treatment had a rotating set of fragrances they used, which means that one of these may be having the effect and the others aren't. And finally, it's only at the end that they were given their neuropsychological testing, and this was to establish memory, verbal learning, planning, and attention switching skills. So again, we don't know exactly which of these, how, why, and what. The data is strong though, given that there's more than a 200% difference between the scores for each group, but we also don't know if by virtue of being involved in a clinical trial of sorts, or more accurately an experiment, focusing on cognitive function, if one group or the other, let's say, chose to train their brain. Although not as common now, elderly individuals are far more likely to spend time doing something like a crossword, compared to much younger individuals, and since all of these were elderly, it's hard to say. There's also issues to know whether or not younger individuals would see the same benefits, and more importantly, at least for the elderly, is if you've already started to see cognitive decline due to pathologies like Alzheimer's, will this help? In news that is much better established, and honestly much more displeasing, there's the oddity in Australia. Well, Australia is an oddity, but this is a specific thing that stands out compared to everything else. It is being bitten by a tick can lead to a red meat allergy, and not only is it relatively unknown, but it's also incredibly common in Australia. While very common in Australia, it's certainly not unique to there. It can be found in the United States of America and other countries. The condition is also known as alpha-gal syndrome, and it's pretty much an autoimmune response to a particular sugar. It's the galactose alpha-1,3 galactose, which is found in, well, most meat, so that explains why you get the reaction you do. The reason why this happens, and effectively why it's hard to treat, is that the alpha-gal sugar that's responsible for this is present in meat that's not in humans. That is, humans simply don't produce this sugar. As a result, when the immune system sees it, it identifies it as foreign and begins to attack it. Of course, when you eat any other red meat thereafter, you get the same reaction again and again. This leads to the immune system from there on figuring out that, well, you have an allergy to this thing. The tick simply kickstarts the immune system to respond to it. There is no treatment for it, and that is one slight issue, and in some individuals it is a lifelong diagnosis. For most individuals, however, you will see a decline in the reaction over time. In news about something people are sticking in themselves that's also bad for them, we have a warning on cigarettes in Canada. Well, many countries have warnings for cigarettes. Some have taken to quite literally stripping the packaging of anything related to cigarettes and simply having graphic images. Others, like Canada, have instead chosen to quite literally put the warning on each individual cigarette. The warnings include things like cigarettes cause impotence, or poison in every puff. This is a rather significant step further than what other countries have taken, and are going to be most likely a significant impact on the tobacco industry in Canada, and whether or not other countries take up the same, let's say, aggressive stance. Given what the smoking eyeball did to Australia, there's a very good chance that this will have a not necessarily negligible effect, nor a significant effect, but still quite pronounced in Canada for now. In news related to research and research misconduct of a kind, we have Didier Raoult, the French researcher who is controversially related to COVID-19 and, well, trying to investigate things like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. For example, making arguments that these would treat COVID-19 when, no, they don't. And this is one reason why they have, before this came to light, resigned their post and chosen to pursue other ambitions. The problem for them is that their work prior to resigning in August of 2022 was also responsible for much of the work, and particularly the ethics applications related to studies that got published. The studies in question have now been identified by audits as being problematic. The biggest concern, let's say, is that among the studies that were examined, 248 used exactly the same ethics approval number. By itself, this isn't a massive issue. Arguably, you could analyze datasets multiple different ways or conduct one very large study as an umbrella and then look at individual elements of it. The issue is that each of the, studies had different numbers of individuals, subjects, countries, and so on, meaning that it's incredibly unlikely that they were the same study. There's also 39 more that didn't even contain an ethics approval number, whilst having done research on humans. That is a big problem. To use a terrible analogy, you can almost think of the ethics approval as being kind of like the receipt for a meal at a restaurant. If everybody's going to chip into it, you can all rely on the same receipt. However, if you're going to have multiple different dinners at different locations with different people, each of them has different receipts and everybody pays their own bit into each. You can't just use the same for all of it. But that appears to be exactly what he's done for a disturbingly large number of studies. In research news that's both encouraging and kind of pointless, we have a PhD student who has been given their PhD in Welsh, which is somewhat funny given that a lot of the Welsh themselves don't actually understand the language. It is something of a dying breed. The individual, Owen Benyon, is the first Welsh speaker to be given a PhD in, Welsh. In slightly further irony, it was given for a PhD in catalytic chemistry, a field which no one else really understands, to help teach about the importance of colon cancer screening. It is the more correct name for arse cancer. The idea of going to the public to try and educate them is one thing, but as employers are finding now, trying to bring workers back to, their workplace, the office, isn't working, and increasingly they are relying on employing people on a temporary basis. In fact, those who are using flexible workplaces and effectively working from home and hot desking are hiring twice as quickly as those who require people to come into the office. This raises interesting questions about the willingness and effect of trying to get people on site. In news from China, which is an oddity given the Great Firewall of China, experts are defending the use and benefits of genetically modified crops. This is all the more odd given that until very recently the Chinese government, the CCP, had a very anti-GMO position. The government even went out and published an opinion piece that had as part of it the following paraphrased quote: "Genetically modified raw materials are as safe as ordinary products and do not cause infertility in humans or animals." The expression "no shit" comes to mind, but ignoring the fact that they've had until, as said very recently, a strong anti-GMO position, it's not surprising to see that they would try and backtrack it now. The reasons for this could well be the fact that there are reports that China is in the midst of a food crisis of sorts. Whether that is the places they've been trying to grow food have experienced floods, drought, or pests, that other areas have experienced landslides and similar, or that the food imports they were relying on from places like Ukraine are practically non-existent. Disconcertingly, for some bizarre reason, the article does appear to be alluding to things like the Seralini study in discussing its safety measures regarding GMO crops, and that the government even says as much. As with much Chinese news, what we're seeing is likely to be questioned extensively, not only for the fact that it's a sudden change in position, but why it's changed, given that of the 4 crops that have received preliminary approvals, those being cotton, rice, corn, and papaya, only 2, cotton and papaya, have actually been approved to be planted out. Next we go to astronomical news and the idea that you could eventually turn an asteroid into a space station, which does sound like the beginnings of a Hollywood film, but no, the actual theory behind it is there. The reason for this proposal is, well, several-fold, and as the article in question goes through in considerable detail, a lot of variables were accounted for. This includes its at least relative proximity to Earth, that is it actually somewhat accessible, whether or not it's in the Goldilocks zone. Is it too far away from the sun and therefore too cold to inhabit, or is it too close to the sun and therefore too hot to inhabit, leading to, well, cooked humans a lot of the time, given that they are stuck on an asteroid with no real way to escape. This is where the choice of asteroid comes in. It's an Terra. A Terra is a particular kind of asteroid, and they're nearly 5 kilometers in diameter, about 3 miles. They also have their own moon effectively, with a much smaller asteroid orbiting it. The author also effectively proposes that all of the initial work should be done by autonomous robots, with the primary materials only needing to be the most complex of materials that could not be made on the asteroid by the robots. That is, you send your initial 4 robots, a base station to support them, and enough electronics, that is, things like processors, boards, and similar, to make 3,000 more of the robots. In combination, you would then have them build things like solar panels and that on site. Theoretically, it would mean each of the payloads for this system would only be 9 metric tons, or just under. The cost of this is about $4.1 billion for each of the, let's say, deployments. Considering that the Apollo program cost $93 billion, it is a significant cost saving. It is, however, well, to be quite blunt about it, very ambitious, mostly because both the calculations are incredibly crude, but also, to be quite blunt about it, the chances of robots surviving the vacuum of space and then eventually their new meteorite home without turning into, well, human-hating AI are pretty slim. The final news we have for you this week is just what it would take to at least win a entry in a lottery, and using the UK lottery as a particular example. The research was done at the University of Manchester, and it was trying to understand how many tickets you would need to guarantee a win. Now, to be clear about this, that's a win which may lose you money, or it might be the grand prize, which is all the money. The research is premised on the UK's national lottery system, which is a single ticket with 6 numbers on it. If 2 of the numbers that are drawn for this are on your ticket, you win money. There are up to 59 random numbers that can be chosen on a given day. However, it is worth pointing out that if you only get 2 numbers, it only gets you a free entry to the next game, not a cash prize. As you get progressively more numbers matched, you get more money. Each ticket itself will cost you £2, and the minimum cash payment you can get for winning is £25. The researchers used geometry to understand what you would need to have to win, and this is a system called the Fano plane. It's a system that has 7 lines and 7 points. Each line has 3 points on it, and each point attaches to 3 lines. If each point represents 2 numbers, and each line represents a ticket with 6 numbers, it allows you to get an idea as to how many you would need to try and get a winning entry. The theoretical number you would need is 27 tickets or £54, remembering that the minimum prize you can get is £25, which means you may spend twice as much money as you could possibly win. By no means is this the most successful possible way to approach the lottery. That's already been done in the past, where someone was able to figure out that if you bought enough tickets with the right corresponding numbers, you would be able to get winnings no matter what, and they then went out and tried to buy every possible ticket that they needed. Admittedly, they weren't able to buy all of them, but they were able to win way more money than they spent on their particular scheme, let's say. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.